In this video, we're going to learn how to create a UFS stimulus test. Creating a UFS stimulus test requires a basic understanding of the stimulus editor concepts, which are covered in the Introduction and Creating a UniPro Stimulus Test video. If you have not already watched that training video, I encourage you to do so now. First, we will open up a UFS stimulus test, give it a name, and select a category. So we'll stay working with our stim demo category, and I will just call this UFS demo and hit OK. This is going to open up almost the same template. You still want to open up your user-test.cs from your solution, and you'll see there's a couple differences. Some of these using statements are slightly different because we're using UFS data, but that's not really something you have to concern yourself with. But you'll notice that my test case type now returns UFS instead of UniPro. So that's telling the app that this is a UFS test, not a UniPro test. I still have the same should run context, and I still have the same test body. Now you'll notice in a UFS test, we pre-populate both the UniPro Exerciser status tools and the UFS Exerciser and status tools. That's because when you're running in UFS, you can actually access tools from both the UFS and the UniPro side. Now, just to keep things a little less confusing, we call this tools and we call this one UFS tools. So I'm just going to go ahead and add UniPro to the front of that so that I know this is a UniPro tool set, and I can quickly identify the difference between my UniPro tools and my UFS tools as I'm going through my code. So again, we give you a little bit of an overview, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete that out of here so that we give some little more space. And starting our test case by booting UFS is not the worst idea, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that line in as well. Now for this UFS test, I'm going to go through a very similar process that we did for the UniPro, and I'm going to read an attribute, change the attribute, and then verify that that attribute was correctly updated. The other thing I encourage you to do as you're writing scripts is use comments to sort of explain what it is you're trying to do. That way someone else who looks at the script later, without having to dig through your code, can figure out what the intention was. That's really, really helpful. It's called commenting your code, and I recommend you get into the habit of that. So to make a comment, it's a double front slash, and then I can type anything I want, and it basically is ignored by the compiler, such as these items here. It just provides information. So what I want to do is I want to read the B boot lun en attribute before changing. Okay, so obviously this isn't syntactically correct. Spelling errors are not a problem. You're just writing some comments so people know what you're doing. Now in order to read an attribute, I use the UFS tools, and I'm going to use the read attribute method. But I want to get that result captured. So the read attribute method returns an attribute request result. So you can see here the attribute request result. And so I'll declare one of those, and I'll call it read result before. And I need to set that to the function that actually goes and reads the data. And that's in my UFS tools. And the method that I care about here is read attribute. Now this particular attribute happens to have an attribute ID of 0. You'll notice in here that there are a ton of parameters, but you'll see that only attribute ID is required. The rest of them, these square brackets, mean that the value is optional, and if you don't specify it, it will have the value you see here. Index will be 0, selector 0, and so all of those are optional. So the only thing you need to read this attribute is a 0. So I'm going to go ahead and read that attribute. Attribute 0 happens to be bboot lun enabled. Now just like before, we want to be able to print that out to our debug console. So I already have a line of code ready to go. I'll just go ahead and paste that in here. And in this case, we're going to write out read result status, and we need the read results query response code and the value. Now again, the application's helping us out. There's some problems with our code. First of all, the debug. Again, I don't have the correct using statement in this test case to access the debug method. So I'm going to drop this down and tell it to use system diagnostics. Next, it's complaining that read result doesn't exist. Well, that's because in this case I call it read result before, and in my copy pasted code I call it read result. So it's a quick fix. You just copy read result before and you paste it over each of these invalid values. And now I'm getting the values from read result before. I'm getting both the query response code and whatever value was returned from read attribute. Okay? Now I want to write the attribute to, and I was trying to comment, so I'll just double slash that. And I want to write the attribute to 2. Okay, I expect the attribute to be a non-2 value initially, so I want to see it change. So I'm going to write it to a 2. To do that, I have the same attribute request result, but this case is my write result, so I'm just going to go ahead and call it write result. And now I'm going to call my UFS Tools dot, and I'm going to do a write attribute. There it is. First parameter, you'll see it needs the attribute ID, and that again is going to be 0. Second parameter, also required, is the attribute value, so I'll write that a 2. Okay? So that's all set. That should write the attribute value, and I just want to make sure that I get a valid query response code. So we'll go ahead and we'll debug write line, write result status, and I'm going to pass in the write result query response code. So that'll print out to my debug console, and I can see that I got a successful write value. Now again, we just want to go ahead and reread that value to make sure it was successful. So I will copy these 3 lines of code, and I'll paste them, and I'm going to make a couple changes. I'm going to say that this is reading the attribute after the change. Okay, spell attribute correctly. And in this case, I don't want read result before. I want to call this read result after. And in my debug write line, I also want to make sure I'm printing the results from read result after instead of read result before. So this, sort of like the UniPro test we walked through, will write an attribute and verify that that write changed by reading it before and after. So we can see the values and we can see that the change occurred. Just like before, I want to put a breakpoint on so we can see this print in the window, and we'll look at it in the app. So first of all, I'll set a breakpoint and return true. We're going to go ahead and save our test case, and we are going to go ahead and build our test case. But before we do that, I want to show you something that will happen in the app so that you'll, again, ready for this to occur. This is a UFS test. Because it's currently not built, the application software doesn't really know what kind of test it is. So if I flip back to our application software, I'm currently still in the UniPro protocol. But if I scroll down to my Stim demo folder, you'll see UFS demo is showing up in the UniPro side. That's because the test is unbuilt and the application does not yet know what kind of test it is. So you've seen this before where your test is disabled and you have to build it. So we'll go back to our test editor, we'll select test editor, and we'll select build stimulus test. Build one succeeded. That looks perfect. When we flip back to our application, you'll notice that the UFS test is now gone. That's because it's now built and the application knows it's a UFS test, so it's no longer going to show up when I'm in UniPro. So I go back up to my configuration here, I'll select UFS, we scroll back down to our test list, and under Stim Demo you'll see there is our UFS demo test ready to go. So before I kick this off, I want to go into debug mode so we can see all our values and make sure everything returns as expected. So back in the builder, I'm just going to go ahead and select build just one more time to make sure that the code's up to date, and then I'll hit debug stimulus test. We're in debug mode to the application software, and in this case this is an attribute we're going to need to have a LUN selected. So I'll select LUN 0, and now I will start my analyzer. I have selected UFS demo, and I will start my stim. The test is run, and you'll notice I've hit my breakpoint at the end. This time, rather than walk through everything, I just let it run to the end, and I just want to verify our output. And so you can see the read result status was 0, which is success, and we got a value of 0. Then down here, our write result status was 0, meaning we had a successful write. And then down here, a read result status of 0 and a value of 2. So it took our write of 2 and returned 2 in our next read. You'll also see that this actually does show some other information, and that's information coming back out from the tools, saying I had a successful data write or a successful data read or whatever else it's kicking out. So you will also see some information here just coming out of the actual toolkit itself. But our reads and writes are right here. It went from 0 to 2. So if I just clear this breakpoint and I'll hit continue, we'll go back to our application software. And if we look at the UFS packet list, once I stop and unload, you should see those commands that we had in our stimulus test. So here is the boot. We'll scroll down to the bottom of this particular test, and down here toward the end, once we're fully booted, there we go. We'll expand these two columns, and you'll see here's my read attribute response. You'll see here's my write and the response, and finally the final read and the response. So the stimulus test ran through and did those 3 commands that we wanted them to do. Now again, there are many different commands available in the library. If I come back over to my test and I'll stop this debugging, you'll notice that if I just type UFS Tools and then I hit period, there's all this stuff I can do. Write 10s, read 10s, write buffers, start and stop units, set flags, all the stuff you'd expect to find in UFS, all the things you can run, all the commands you can issue. I'm not going to go through each one of these, obviously, and if you go ahead and look in that documentation we looked at earlier, all of these things should be laid out for you, plus you have IntelliSense here to help you out. So that's a basic UFS test. We've only touched on the surface of the power of what you can do with the stimulus tools. So I encourage you to go read the stimulus user's guide and also spend a little bit of time in that stimulus API reference. And again, those can be found on the test editor menu help. You have your UniPro stimulus editor manual. The UFS stimulus editor manual will be up shortly. And then you have the stimulus editor API documentation, which will really tell you all the different methods and properties that you can run in both your UniPro and your UFS tool sets.